A common problem with apologetics that try to argue God's existence by appealing to morality is what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. In one of Plato's Socratic dialogues, Socrates asks what exactly theists mean when they say that a god is good. Is a god good by some standard of good that exists independent of that god? Or is a god good because good is defined as whatever a god does or is? If what they mean is that a god conforms to some independent standard of good, that means that we don't need to look to gods to learn what good is. We can just look at that standard. If, however, what theists mean when they say that a god is that good is defined as whatever a god does or is, then saying that a god is good is a meaningless tautology. It means nothing more than saying God is godly. This also seems like an arbitrary basis for a system of morality. To say that a person ought to do what is good is simply to say that one ought to do what God says. But why ought one do what God says? William Lane Craig seemed to think that he had a way around this problem for a while, because he used to argue that a good action is good not because God says so, but because it conforms to his nature, and his nature is good. But this just shifts the dilemma to God's nature. Why ought we do what is consistent with God's nature? When asked this, Craig said that we have an obligation to do that which is consistent with God's nature because obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a competent authority. But that puts us back onto the first horn of the dilemma. Does the obligation to obey a competent authority objectively arise independent of a god? If it does, then there is at least one objective moral duty that exists independent of God, which refutes the argument that objective moral duties can only come from God. However, if this objective moral duty to obey God comes from the fact that God says to obey God, then we're back onto the second horn of the dilemma. So how does Craig deal with that?
Hello. I was once talking to a philosophy student, and he suggested that God is not required for objective moral laws to exist. And he pointed this out when I was arguing with him. I basically said that since God created us, we are morally obligated to obey him, and therefore he's able to impose moral duties on us.
The argument this kid is making is even sillier than any I've heard Craig make, but it's one I hear a lot. He seems to think that the fact that God made us, if indeed he did, means that he gets to tell us what to do. This seems like a non sequitur to me. I doubt that many would say that children, for example, would be obligated to do whatever their parents commanded them to, even if there were no God acting as a higher overriding authority.
But then he said that the fact that we are obligated to obey someone who creates us suggests a moral law that exists outside of God, and therefore there can be...
Say that again. What suggests that the moral law exists outside God?
The principle that we are obligated to obey God since he created us.
Oh, I see.
And so the idea is that if that moral law can exist outside of God, then who's to say that other moral laws don't exist outside of God?
Okay, you have asked a very profound question. I would refer you to the debate that I had with Professor Eric Wielenberg recently. It's on YouTube, about the foundation of objective moral values and duties. And I would say two things in response to this. First of all, it may well be the case that any moral view will have its explanatory stopping point, its ultimate, beyond which you cannot go. There will be simply an explanatory ultimate. And what I would say is that God is a less arbitrary and more plausible explanatory stopping point than anything else the atheist can suggest, such as the flourishing of sentient life, the flourishing of human beings. On atheism, those stopping points are arbitrary and, I think, premature.
Let's note what Craig is saying here. He believes that the idea that something is moral because it helps sentient beings flourish is less arbitrary than because God says so. This seems to imply that if God commanded the severest possible suffering for everyone, this would be more plausibly justified by the mere fact that God commands it, or because it is consistent with his nature, than wanting the greatest possible pleasure for everyone just for its own sake. Also, in what sense is God a more probable stopping point? If Craig means that God is a more probable moral stopping point, I don't see how that could be judged without an independent standard of morality. And because God says so isn't even comparable to naturalistic stopping points. Because nobody who advocates that the stopping point be the flourishing of sentient beings says it's justified because the flourishing of sentient beings leads to the flourishing of sentient beings. Theists would see such an argument as ridiculous, and who could blame them? I like using the flourishing of sentient beings as a moral stopping point, but if someone asked me what its objective justification is, I wouldn't make some circular argument for it. I would just say, who cares? Do you want to flourish or not?
Whereas when you get to God, you've reached a metaphysical ultimate beyond which you cannot go, and so it is a more plausible explanatory stopping point. The second thing, though, I think I would say is this. Suppose you say that the reason we should obey God's commands is because He has commanded us to. In other words, God's commands are self-inclusive. If God has said, obey all that I command you, then that is itself something that He has commanded us. And so it would be comprised in itself. And it seems to me that this is a perfectly legitimate justification for saying why we should obey God, because He has commanded us to, and our moral duties are constituted by His commands. So I think it's a kind of self-inclusive or self-justifying stopping point.
So you see, folks, the fact that the only reason theists can give you to obey what God says is because God says that we should obey what God says isn't really a problem. It's just an explanatory stopping point. Though it's kind of weird that this explanatory stopping point is not at all explanatory. If I ask why I ought to obey what God commands, and the answer is that it's because God commands it, that doesn't explain That's just a restatement of the assertion that I asked to be explained in the first place. Another reason it's not a good explanatory stopping point is that if I ask why we ought to obey God's commands to obey His commands, the answer presumably would be because He commands that we obey His command to obey His commands. And if I ask why we ought to obey that, the answer would be because He commands us to obey His command to obey His command to obey His commands. Ad infinitum. It's not a stopping point at all. It's an infinite regress. When it comes to the flourishing of sentient beings as a moral standard, I'd be much more psychologically able to apply that in the absence of any justification than I would be to obey a command to make everyone endure the worst possible suffering without any further justification than because an omniscient being says so. That's a command that I simply couldn't get myself to obey. If ought implies can, then it would make no sense to say that I ought to obey such a command. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.